Hello, I'm Janice Ellig, CEO of the Ellig Group, Executive Search Advisors, where we are reimagining search by our longstanding commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. Thank you for joining me today for another webinar in our series where we invite thought leaders and subject matter experts to offer their advice to help guide us during these difficult times. Today's topic is In the Interim, Managing Executive Transition. And I am delighted to welcome today's guests, our IIC partners, which stands for International Independent Consultants from Toronto, Canada, the Farber Group, partner, and Charlene Bergman, Managing Director, and from Ellig Group, Barbara Stahley, Managing Director. And I'd like to add that the Farber Group and the Ellig Group each have 40 years in the business of executive search and advisory services, so 80 years together. And I don't think we look it. But anyway, we're really so happy to join you today. We invite our audience participation and we will try to answer all of your questions live, but if not, we will respond to you by email. And all of our webinars are on our website, so please do visit. So now we have much to cover and we want to get started, and I want to welcome Ian and Charlene, who will be covering interim management, and Barbara will giving advice on executives in transition. So Ian, can you provide an overview when hiring interim executives? It's an important strategy, and I want to hear what you have to say about companies, particularly in terms of how you work with them in redefining that strategy when it comes to transitional employment or to supplement a need or to fill a temporary gap.
Great, thanks, Janice. And firstly, great to be online with you. One of the silver linings of what we're going through is being able to collaborate across borders and time zones. So thank you again from Charlene and myself. So when I think of the world of interim management, there's sort of three lenses that we look at it through. The first, I would say, is sort of a more traditional lens, and that's when companies are bringing in executives to either supplement or replace an executive or a gap in skill set. So that may be your more traditional around a maternity leave or perhaps ill health on an executive, something that personally we haven't seen through COVID, but we've heard of companies where they've had to bring in an executive at short notice due to ill health. So these are sort of general bandwidth supplementing type positions. It might be a backfilling of a role. So for example, we've put in an interim CFO whilst the company worked through a very detailed search, and that over a number of months, just to make sure that the company continued with its critical projects. And then there might be, the demands of perhaps a change in legislation. So if we go back to Sarbanes-Oxley time, perhaps, where they were putting in resources to help supplement a specialized skill. So those have been sort of your more traditional interim positions. Recently, in particular the last number of years, as sort of agile thinking has come into being, we've seen companies shift to more strategic use of interim. And that's more for, let's call them change or transformation projects. And I think that's where it gets really interesting from a COVID perspective. I mean, that's where they're looking for very specific know-how. Companies either want to augment skills or define and design and create a function. So maybe they want to, their finance function to catch up to where the rest of the business is, or the HR function. Or it might be for critical projects. So, perhaps there's an M&A transaction that's happening and the support that comes in, the implementation of an ERP, or we've even had companies hire for a new product launch, bring in a CMO for a situation. So these are critical projects that interims are thought of in a more strategic light. What I think is really interesting is, and I'm going to ask for a slide to be brought up at this point, is to really take a step back. And I think this is where, looking to the organization of the future, and I think this is the real opportunity in COVID times. Traditionally, we've operated with a very siloed functional approach to how we deliver and get work done. And I think, and we've seen this trend emerge over the past number of years. But what we're really seeing now through COVID and into the future is what I would term a disrupted organization chart. And that's where you flip your chart on its side and you say, what is the task that needs to get done? What is the problem that needs to get solved? And then backfill into the type of resources that are best suited to deploy that. So yes, you are going to continue to have your traditional, hired employee. But I think herein lies the opportunity to bring in interim managers, freelancers, and then, as we just, showing in the slide here, right through to AI and robotics. So looking at different ways to solve for resourcing. And I think that's, as I said, that's the opportunity and the exciting piece around interim management that we're certainly seeing our clients look at.
And will we be seeing both? I mean, is it not a versus, but it's not an either or, but it's an and?
I think it's an and. It's a both. We've seen companies open up to this, and yeah, it's for us. It's definitely an and. And there could be what we'll talk about a bit later is interim roles where you come in, define a role, establish the right team, the right framework, and often we see that interim role merge into a permanent position. So that's a different way of thinking of it from an and, because now that person knows the culture of the organization, they've built and designed the way that function looks, and now they're positioned to take the company forward with the rest of the team.
And you actually started more in the interim, didn't you, as advisors in Toronto, didn't you?
Yeah, then we actually, came out of 2008-9 is when we launched our interim practice, and that then was practice for what we're seeing now, and that was to help companies who needed the flexibility of interim, perhaps didn't have the cash flow, didn't know what the organization was going to look like coming out of the 08-09 recession, and they used the benefits of interim to help them through that.
So Charlene, why an interim executive might that be critical, a critical option during COVID-19?
So it's really interesting, Janice, because if you think back, if we look back a year ago, we were in a very different market. We were in a talent shortage market, and there was interest certainly in interim at that point. Certainly we were seeing it as a way to solve a shortage of skills or resource gaps within organizations. And also, I guess, with the automation transformation agenda that was rapidly evolving, including AI, that brought a different way of thinking and related talent shifts, and therefore an interest in creating more of an agile organization during these changes. And in fact, I think, a year ago, we did see reports that was saying that by 2025, majority of the workforce would be employed in an agile capacity. But if you look at 2020, since March, certainly, there has been a very different landscape. And so companies have had to accomplish very difficult tasks. They've had to pivot their businesses and really, in record time, produce some sort of positive results. There was a very interesting McKinsey article recently that spoke to 3 changes, where organizations have demonstrated that agility and used interim certainly to achieve that. And one is in, redeploying talent, of course. The other was in launching new business models, which we've seen, countless examples of even sort of curbside delivery in 2 days versus a planned for 18 months project. And then actually one that's relevant for us in terms of our interim practice is in developing new products. So I think, you've seen a number of engineering companies who've redesigned their manufacturing facility to produce ventilators. And we had a similar experience with a medtech organization who, if I shift back a few years, actually hired a CEO from us at relatively short notice. And he then hired an interim CFO who herself transitioned into a permanent CFO position. And 4 years on, which would have been 2019, she actually was promoted and succeeded the CEO. So through COVID, they've actually been awarded a huge contract to supply respirators, which will deliver 20 times the revenue that they had budgeted or forecast in 2020. So they've embraced interims in various roles because they've had to execute on their plan. So really, you know, when we think of this, it's really all about speed, and it's getting things done quickly and doing them well. A couple of other COVID-related, relevant topics with interim is there's a desire to break down silos within organizations now and sort of work really well cross-functionally, such that, you know, companies can achieve these rapid results and tackle interdisciplinary projects. So that certainly has helped during this period when you bring in interims or subject matter experts who can, you know, jump into a situation and join those teams. And really what's been of benefit is that it's given companies access to a very broad and a diverse and experienced skill base, you know, individuals they may not normally have considered bringing in. And these have helped, these individuals have helped to deliver very quick results. And you know, as I think forward and as businesses and markets begin to reopen, I think there'll be a view from, you know, the leaders of organizations that there will be a need in certain industries, certainly in certain sectors in particular, where there'll be a talent scarcity again. And they will need to hire interims to supplement who they have. And off the top of our heads, of course, we can think of technology, e-commerce, healthcare, of course, is particularly relevant. So, you know, in order to build that agile workforce and perhaps come out of this, you know, gaining market share, being a strong leader or competitor, I think these interims will certainly bring value. So there is a slide which really demonstrates, you know, or just, I guess, triggers the thinking or the questions that as an organization, people should be asking themselves. And I think we'll share this with you afterwards. But these are the questions you should be really pondering with respect to, are you getting what you need during COVID? And if not, perhaps you can supplement with interim resources.
And of course, this will go on post-COVID too, won't it? So Ian, in considering, you know, interim executives rather than a full-time, how do you weigh that? And what's the value proposition? You know, what do you do in terms of the impact of an interim executive versus, you know, positives and negatives?
Yeah, so in terms of the value proposition, and there are certain sort of risks and challenges that I often hear from hiring managers or hiring decision makers around interim. Most of those are around the ability of the interim resource to fit in from a cultural perspective, and the ability to impact at short notice. But I think, you know, the type of resource that we're talking about here is often an interim resource you're actually over-hiring in terms of capability, for one. So they've been there, done that. They're wearing the scars of different transformations, different experiences, whether it's distressed or non-distressed. They've really seen a lot in their career, and Charlene will talk later to the sort of typical profile that we found are the most effective. The other point is that which is tied to that, is that they're often sort of more mature I would say, from an emotional intelligence perspective. They're able to blend into the organization. Often they're not tied into some of the perhaps more political, cultural issues that, you know, a new executive might have to navigate. They're brought in with a specific task in mind, and the focus is on delivering that task, bringing value to the organization quickly. And so they don't get mired down into org charts and org structures. They're there for a specific purpose, and if communicated correctly within the organization, it kind of paves the way for them to be successful in that role. In terms of other elements of the value proposition, speed, as Charlene referred to, particularly in these times, is key. And so the ability to bring someone in, you know, our mindset, one of my colleagues who I work with in this, he refers to it as we work with a watch as opposed to a calendar. Like, we've literally, last week we had a situation where, you know, we got a call on a Wednesday. By the Thursday, we'd wrapped up what the mandate looked like. By Monday, our executive started in this organization, a medical services business. So the time to bring a resource in, and this is really key for who you use in finding that resource, in terms of being able to have a bench of qualified people is critical. And so within literally 48 hours, we were able to bring someone to the table, and they were a weekend and off to the races. So I think those would be a lot of the value props that we would talk to. The other point, looking at it from a candidate perspective, they are, their reputation as an interim is dependent on their ability to be successful, make an impact, and deliver. And so their personal brand is often at risk and at stake. And so there's an alignment of motivations there for them to bring value quickly, and get on with it, and help the organization out. So I think those are, just touching on the high level
Right.
in terms of value prop.
Right. But I mean, how are they received into a company when they know they're coming in for a shorter period of time, or maybe not, permanently? Are they received well by other employees? Is this, because they're not going there full time, right? They're not there for the long haul. Is this an adjustment for the others as well as themselves?
Yeah, I think, and maybe there's a point that Bob can reflect on from a human or an EQ perspective. I think the key here is around the communication piece about how they are brought in. Getting the buy-in of the management team and the organization around, okay, what is the task? What is the need that arose? What's the task at hand? How do we make sure that this individual is ramped up quickly and as effectively as possible? So, like many things, it all comes down to communication, not just allowing. We've all have heard the impact of onboarding. In the case of an interim, it's similar principles around communication, designing an appropriate structure for the onboarding, and then maintaining, being intentional about bringing them on.
So maybe, Charlene, you can just tap into a little bit of the competencies and the roles that you are really filling with some of these interim executives.
Yeah, and I will build on what Ian has said, because that's really relevant to what is a successful interim, and you do want to make the right hire. So, if we think back to early in this conversation, you do need to consider what is the strategy and what is the business need. So whether it's augmenting or replacing on the one hand, or if it's somebody who can deal with adversity and change, or a project. And there are certain competencies that are similar across all of those, but ultimately it varies depending on the situation and the subject matter expertise. But I would say that universally a successful interim is someone who's very adaptable, agile. It's probably built a pretty deep toolkit, as we like to call it, over a long career. And over a long career means 20 years roughly, with 5 or 6 or more perhaps organizations that they've worked for, and through their career they've actually advanced and developed as well, but at the same time have seen a lot of different things, complex challenges, whether it's mergers and acquisitions, recessions and booming economies, major disruptors, adversity, 9/11, 2008, 2009, and now, of course, COVID with the pandemic. So it's important that they've actually seen and experienced some different and sometimes difficult situations. An interim needs to be a resource to be at the board, the CEO, so they need to function very effectively, both from a strategic perspective, but with an analytical mindset, strong team and relationship building skills, and be a problem solver, no doubt. So, we talked a little earlier about cross-functional collaboration as well. So they need to know how to navigate across an organization and integrate into those other business units. So that usually does come with a high emotional intelligence. We mentioned maturity, influencing without authority, and just demonstrating that type of leadership in order to sort of build community within an organization. So it's more actually about fitting in than the actual fit. So, if they're going to make an immediate impact. So the types of roles are, vary, but I think, we see a lot in the areas of, whether it's a startup or a company going through growth, where they would naturally be hiring, influencers and leaders to take them through that, or transformation. And then, of course, the turnaround or restructuring or distress, which we're seeing a lot more now. And it's across all industries, really, and across the C-suite, but a lot of the interim opportunities that we tend to work on are CEO, CFO, CHRO, particular right now. And then if it's a restructuring engagement, of course, a CRO, Chief Restructuring Officer. But it really can be right across, through technology, supply chain, all of those corporate functional areas is what we see.
So let's turn to our certified executive coach, Barbara. And Barbara Stahley, this is one of the questions we have too that's come in from our audience, who says how a potential employee can leverage the disruptive trend and align skills and approach to build a career and grow. And it was one of the questions you and I spoke about, is in terms of during these difficult times, how do you, build your career? But, and how do you approach this job market when you may find that you're, going to be out of work, right? And then how do you transition into a new role when you haven't necessarily planned for that?
Right.
So what are some of the steps that you're not prepared? What do you do?
Well, the first thing you should do is take a long, deep breath, right? Because it's jarring to find yourself suddenly and unexpectedly in the job market. So acknowledge that.
Right.
And then use this time to reflect on your career and all that you've accomplished, businesses you've run and grown, programs you've developed. I usually recommend that people take the time to sit down and over the course of a few days, create a running list of your most notable accomplishments and where you've made the greatest impact, because you'll likely be surprised by how much you've forgotten and are now remembering when you're able to sort of lift your head up and look around. The second thing you should do is plan for the future intentionally, because you have this time. Really think about what you want to be doing. So many of us find ourselves almost on autopilot in our careers, promotions, raises, bigger teams, new assignments, that we don't always stop and ask ourselves, is this really what I want to be doing? So talk to your family and your friends, your trusted advisors, a coach if you have one, and do an inventory of your expertise, your experience, and your interests. And then with that inventory completed, you're ready to work on what I call a personal branding refresh. So update your social media and your resume to reflect that inventory. Work on your elevator pitch. Make sure that it really captures what differentiates you from others, and create content on places like LinkedIn. And then finally, network. This is the time to really re-energize your network. Start by reaching out to people and asking them how they're doing during this weird time that we're all living through. They'll probably be surprised by how easily the conversation flows from there.
Barbara, I remember during the financial crisis, 2008, but 2009 and 10 also, you and I spent a lot of times not doing executive searches, but really speaking to both men and women about how to retool and how to look even outside of their industry, right, to others where they could take what they had and maybe call on others that they knew throughout their career and find a job, a position that maybe they even went in there part-time, but then could go full-time. Or as our colleagues in Toronto were saying, do interim work and then could go full-time. So there's so many different ways of getting back into the job market that you can work on, right?
Yeah, there truly are. And during the financial crisis, I was actually recruiting interim executives, ironically enough, into the financial services and professional services market. But that was a space, that was a sector that kept going. It wasn't as strong as it had been, but they were definitely hiring, and they were looking for leaders with the situational leadership experience, with the composure, with all of the attributes that Charlene and Ian were talking about, who could bring that to bear in an organization that was undergoing such, uncertainty, and really make an impact quickly.
And you talk about the network. Basically, we find people really want to help people. And so reaching out to the network is so important, right? And people, it's 6 degrees, maybe 3 degrees, maybe 2 degrees of separation,
Yes.
really reaching out and tapping people because people want to help other people. So important to do.
It is.
Janice, just to reinforce the point you were making, and Barb, we have conversations with a lot of candidates who don't think about interim. They stay fixated on that permanent role. And I think, from the perspective of opening up opportunities, creating your own personal brand, or maybe even shifting from one industry to the next. We had that in Canada in sort of 2010, 11 with the downside of the mining industry. We had a lot of mining executives who couldn't get out of that label as a mining CFO or a mining CEO. And interim actually became their way out of that label and just opened up a world of opportunity to them. So it's absolutely an opportunity, both on the candidate side and, of course, on the corporate side as well.
Right.
And it is, Ian, because people have these transferable skills, right? And so if you're using this time to really reflect, and most of the time we're not even aware of what we have that is so transferable from one industry to the next, or even sometimes one function to the next, that if you take the time, you are your best ambassador, you are your best salesperson. So really reflect on it.
Yeah.
And so, Barbara, so people are in many roles now, but we're finding, and you're speaking with them very actively about, they're contemplating a change. We hear about this, and they're strategically looking for a planned transition. Give us some of the steps that they can look at in terms of making that transition to another role. What that planned transition. They may still be working, but they're thinking about, maybe this isn't the employer I want, maybe this isn't the career I want, and you're working with somebody right now on this, aren't you?
That's a great question, Janice. I was talking to just someone yesterday about this, and I've talked to so many people who have really found themselves rethinking their priorities over the past few months. COVID has really prompted a lot of us to take stock of our lives, our careers, our families, our communities, and do that hard but important work of self-reflection. So, if you find yourself planning for a transition, the first thing I recommend is developing a strategy, and frankly, one that takes into account the implications of whatever change you're contemplating. Maybe you're thinking about staying in your career, but moving to a competitor who's committed to incorporating remote working into their culture once this is all over. That's great. What do you want to do with the time saved from no longer commuting? Do you want to volunteer, coach your kid's soccer team? And maybe you've decided to make a complete career change and move from Wall Street to a nonprofit organization. What skills do you need to acquire? Financially, are you able to make that leap? So these are all things that you should really reflect on and plan for in advance. The second thing.
Sorry. This is happening, though, you're seeing both for men and women, right? I mean, it's not.
Absolutely.
Right. So all are contemplating this.
Everyone is contemplating this. We are all, I think, being impacted in different ways, but also in many similar ways by what's going on. And across the board, we are all sort of taking stock and reflecting. And for some people, it's prompting them to really rethink, how do we want to spend our time? So the second thing that I recommend you do is really begin reinvigorating your network now. You can never start this too soon. So catching up with old acquaintances and colleagues, and even developing new contacts now means that those relationships will be current when you eventually reach out to them. We know that networking is such a key way that people find jobs. So by keeping these relationships fresh, you'll feel less awkward, when you reach out to them for introductions or advice later on. And also, people love to share about themselves. So ask them about their industries, their work, their own career transitions. You'll get some great insights.
So I'll ask Barbara, and then I'll ask everybody, what can employers do to help employees, executives during these very, very difficult times? I mean, when people say that they're not impacted, or they don't get depressed, or they don't, really aren't concerned, that's not true. I mean, these are difficult, difficult times for everybody, whether it be their family members, themselves, a relative. These are difficult times. We have never gone through anything like this. Maybe World War II was similar, but I don't think we were going through that ourselves during then. These are difficult times. What can employers do to help employees as well? Barbara.
The first thing they can do is model this behavior at the top, these conversations, demonstrating these vulnerabilities by having these conversations, because that signals to everyone else that, it's okay and it's not just me. And I think that opens up communication and transparency and allows people to really fully understand that we're all in this together. And sometimes because we're now not in the office, we're all in our separate corners working from home, we may not have that sense of togetherness. So if the leaders can sort of set the tone at the top and model that behavior and really foster this dialogue, it will go a long way.
This is a great time to refine our listening skills. And people have a need to be heard. And I think as leaders, we want to solve people's problems. We want to solve our own problems. And I think we just need to take a step back and listen to what people are saying. There is a need to be heard, and by doing that, it's just going to open up so many opportunities for companies and for their employees.
Charlene?
The only thing we add, and I think you've both covered it, but in that listening is really inclusion. And it's it's so interesting, even in our team, listening to what people are talking about and what's important to them, and maintaining our corporate culture, which we love. And so it's really important to understand what they're looking for, and finding ways as an organization to include them and their voice, but also be inclusive in social activities and other things that are going to help get them through this period. It's not all about tasks and productivity. I think it's so much more, and they have the answers to a lot of what we need to do as leaders.
Yeah, I think I'm very encouraged when I hear our CEOs speak today, and I think they're coming together about the changes that need to be made on all fronts, starting with education and being very inclusive and bringing in people of color from the entry level and moving it all the way up the top, women, but being inclusive at all levels, and people feeling like they can bring their authentic selves to work. I think we have a lot to do in that area, and it really is not just one person, but all of us collectively. And I think we in the search and advisory business can do so much more, and for us also to listen, but for also us to work with our clients and to maybe push the envelope a little bit, and to tell them we can do so much more for them if they will give a little bit in some areas. So I think we're trying to do that in the search and advisory business and coaching business. And so I think through these webinars and the expertise of you all, we can make a difference. And of course, with our audience also and participating with us, we can all make a difference. So thank you for being with us today. Are there any parting words that you want to give?
So perhaps I'll just sort of shoot firstly, thank you for giving us this opportunity. I would sort of just leave you with a thought. If you look at the word, going back to the source of this, the word interim, if you just purely look at the word, it has a connotation of impermanence, of transition, sort of a placeholder, a period of uncertainty and disruption, and boy, do we have enough of that at the moment. But I think if you kind of step back and look at it from more of a strategic leadership perspective, I think it's really an opportunity. It means adjustment, it means adaptation, and for me, it's more of an optimistic word around transformation. So if you can just reframe interim around that, then I think we've made some progress. So again, thank you from me.
Well, thank you to our partners in Toronto. We are going to help transform a lot together. And so to our audience out there, thank you for joining us today. Everybody stay safe and stay well, and join us for our next webinar.